Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming this afternoon to our final session on reclaiming the narrative, teaching the truth about Native American boarding schools. This session is part 2 of our series and is geared for lessons specific for grades 9 through 12. We will introduce ourselves in a minute, but I just wanted to say that and give credit to the collaboration that occurred in the Arizona Department of Education between the Academic Standards Unit and the Office of Indian Education, as well as giving credit also to the Phoenix Indian Visitors School Center and the Administration for Native Americans, who really helped partner and collaborate with us on creating this wonderful opportunity for professional learning for you all today.
Great. So just like in part 1, we will be asking in just a moment when you introduce yourselves in the chat that you please also include a quick land acknowledgement. And so in part 1, we showed you a video from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture that spoke to the importance of honoring Native land and what that means to a variety of Indigenous peoples from various tribal affiliations. While we won't show that video again, we are dropping the link in the chat. That link has a variety of other resources that you can use to learn about honoring Native land as well. So if you're unfamiliar with who the tribal nation is closest to you or on whose ancestral homelands you live or work on, you can use that link that Linda just dropped in the chat. So now we're going to take just a few minutes to more formally introduce ourselves. As we're doing that, if you could please share your introductions in the chat by sharing your name, your role, the organization that you're affiliated with, and also the tribal nation closest to you, or again, on whose ancestral homelands you live or work. And so, Petu Washte, Helen Wape Thomas, Ima Chape Kusto, Malakota Kusto, Chante Washte Nape Chiazapi. So, hello, good day. My name is Helen Thomas. I am the Professional Learning Coordinator for the Office of Indian Education. I just introduced myself in Lakota. I am Hunkpapa Lakota and a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And given our topic today, I just find it really important to name that I was taught to introduce myself that way by my grandmother, Helen Elkire, who was a paraprofessional, a classroom educator, and then ended her career as a Lakota language teacher. And I mentioned that because she was also a boarding school survivor. And so I just want to share and honor her and some of my motivation for why I think this topic is really important. And I'm really grateful that you all are here joining us today. So with that, I'll pass it off to Linda to introduce herself.
So thank you, everyone. My name is Linda Burrows, and I am the Director for K-12 Social Studies in World and Native Languages here at the Department of Education. I also would like to acknowledge and thank our community partners, Melita Yazi, who is from the Phoenix Indian School Center, and also Professor Manuel Pino, who is a professor of American Indian Studies, both at ASU and Scottsdale Community College. And without their cooperation and help, we would not be able to provide this with you and for you today. I'd also like to take a moment and acknowledge that the Arizona Department of Education is located on the ancestral homelands of the Akimel Otham and Peeposh peoples. We also recognize that the Akimel Otham and Peeposh peoples as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, and acknowledge that without their knowledge and contributions, we would not be able to survive on these lands as guests today. We also want to just take a minute to acknowledge that the Phoenix metropolitan area is one of the largest urban Native populations in the United States.
Thank you, Linda. And so we want to open up the space today, reminding ourselves of our community agreements. These are the same agreements from part 1 of our session. But the first agreement is that we are all here to learn, right? We want to recognize that as the facilitators and the designers of this space, we really wanted to keep in mind how to leverage and honor the valuable knowledge and experiences you bring as experts into this space as well. So we're really excited to not only learn with you, but also from you throughout our time today. We also want to ensure that you're taking care of yourself and others. And this particular agreement is our way of being trauma informed as well. Just as a reminder that this is a heavy topic. It can bring up emotional responses. It can be difficult to discuss. And so if you need to step away or take care of your needs in any way, please do so. We also ask that you take care of each other. If you notice that somebody in the chat has a question, or if you know of a resource that speaks to the topic at hand, please share that in the chat, drop that link. We will be sharing the chat transcription along with the slides following our session today. And then lastly, because of our limited amount of time together, we please ask that you come into the space expecting and accepting non-closure. This is just a starting point, this conversation. We're hopeful that you will walk away today from our session today with resources, tools, and language that you can use to further your learning and start to apply this into your classroom context. But we welcome any questions or support you might need. And towards the end of our time together today, we will be explaining how we can continue learning and supporting each other as a community following our series closure.
Helen, before we go on, I noticed that Professor Pino is with us today, and I wanted to give him a moment to introduce himself.
How about our Chinese? She no me petri I esta usha chano yakakukani chano. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I just introduced myself in my first language, which is Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, where I'm from. At Acoma, we have the distinction of being the oldest continuous inhabited village in North America. So my ancestors have been in this part of the world for a very long time. It's a pleasure to have had the opportunity to work with Linda and Helen on this very important ongoing project that addresses one of our major concerns in Indian country, the history of federal Indian boarding schools. Welcome all. It's a pleasure to be with you. Tawae. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pino. We are so grateful to have your knowledge and expertise in the space, and we are super grateful for everything you've offered in this partnership.
So with our agenda today, we have gone over our welcomes and introductions. We plan to review culturally responsive and culturally sustaining, as well as trauma-informed teaching, what that looks like. We want to explore resources to teach about Native American boarding schools and examine how Native American boarding schools fits into the Arizona standards. And lastly, we'll leave time for a few and some closing reflections. We have a few learning outcomes for us as a group today. We're hoping that you will feel comfortable and be able to demonstrate an understanding about culturally responsive teaching, as well as understanding what developmentally appropriate resources you can use to teach about Native American boarding schools, and how to then integrate that into our classrooms and into your already existing curriculum. We're not asking you to rewrite your curriculum, but find ways in which you can introduce this content into your already existing scopes and sequences. We'll also allow time for you to brainstorm and really talk with your peers about how to do this and what this looks like in your classrooms. And we really hope that you feel confident today in your ability to go forward with the new school year starting, feeling rejuvenated and revitalized and excited about being able to teach this really important subject matter.
So with that being said, we want to take some time to hear from you directly. What do you already know about culturally responsive or sustaining or trauma-informed teaching? We know that these terms are somewhat of buzzwords right now in education, and so we want to be very intentional about gathering some input from you all about where you're at in your understanding of these concepts. As we said, we'll offer some brief overview, some beginning understandings, but this will really help us moving forward beyond this space, how we can continue to support you all and your needs. We also ask that you reflect on what questions you're bringing into the space regarding teaching about Native American boarding schools. If you voice these questions now, we can be sure to try and address them throughout our time together. I also want to note, we dropped the link in the chat to the Mentimeter where you can anonymously share your responses. But if you're calling in from a mobile device or for some other reason are unable to access the link, You can always share your responses directly in the chat. As I said, we will share that out as well. And then throughout our time together today, if you have any questions that come up, please be sure to drop them in the chat and we will address them at the appropriate time. So with that, I think we'll take a few minutes to respond to the Mentimeter, and I will get it pulled up and ready to share with you all. Okay, so we already have some responses. Our Mentimeter flows through the responses for us, so I'll give you a moment to read some of these. People interested in learning more, no training at the professional level. We do want to acknowledge that someone put in here that they have not received formal training, but they have background knowledge from family who are survivors. And we do want to honor and acknowledge all those Indigenous educators in our space who likely have lived experience around this topic. And we want to honor that as just as valuable as any formal training that, as we said in our community agreements, that type of experience and knowledge is valued in this space. And we encourage you to share as you feel comfortable during some of our reflection activities. Someone saying that Arizona had a high number of Native American boarding schools, cultural erasure, building relationships with students is important. Looking at trauma-informed teaching in relation to behavior in the classroom. I love this reflection that says, I'm aware, I have to be more aware. I love that self-reflection, and we're grateful that you're all here in this space today to do some of that learning together. Great. So please continue adding to the Mentimeter as you need. We will be returning to that as facilitators to review any of the questions that are there. But again, you can drop any questions you have directly in the chat as well.
So now we're going to start with our first two learning outcomes and transition us into examining what exactly is culturally responsive and trauma-informed teaching. We're going to be giving you and providing for you a brief overview of how the Arizona Office of Indian Education defines culturally responsive teaching, and also be looking at another resource for you with regards to trauma-informed curriculum from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Yes, so we'd like to begin by offering how the Arizona Office of Indian Education has started to develop a working definition of culturally responsive or culturally sustaining practices. And we say working definition because this may be changed, it might be expanded upon in the future, but currently we're beginning to define culturally responsive teaching and learning as informed by or intentionally integrating cultural strengths in order to master Arizona state standards. And so when we say cultural strengths, we mean things like students' funds of knowledge, their community cultural wealth, the ways of knowing and being that they bring with them into the classroom. And I want to be mindful that when we say cultural strengths, we're not just talking about what students know, what kinds of topics and concepts they're familiar with, but also how they come to know those things. We can recognize that our students bring with them from their communities routines, communication styles, and information processing strategies that have been longstanding in those communities and how they shared information. We also want to be mindful and take a moment to talk about language. We are, as an office, moving towards using the language of culturally sustaining and revitalizing education. And what this means is that both the home and mainstream cultural knowledge and ways of being and knowing are valued, maintained, nurtured, really sustained. But we do want to pose a question to you all to think about, given what we learned in part 1 of this series, why is it important to include that word revitalizing in addition to sustaining? So culturally sustaining and revitalizing education is something put forth specifically for Indigenous students. And so we want to give you an opportunity to make some connections to part 1 and what we learned about what happened in federal Indian boarding schools, to think about why many Indigenous scholars and educators are calling for culturally sustaining and revitalizing education. So we'll take just a moment. I know yesterday people had some very, very thoughtful reflections that take just a minute or so to type out. So we'll give you a moment. Thank you to those that are sharing in the chat. Someone shared Indigenous languages were almost wiped out in the boarding schools because people were not allowed to speak those languages. Continue to engage our students and ourselves. Yes. But yeah, I think the first comment, and I know more will come in, really speaks to what we mean. That word revitalizing conveys, right, that it's something that needs to be restored, rebuilt, reclaimed. And so including revitalizing is really our way of acknowledging the history of the harm that's occurred in schooling with Indigenous students. Yes, I love these reflections that we shouldn't just survive, we should also be able to thrive. Revitalizing because it's not present in most schools. Rebuild the broken. Exactly. Thank you so much to everyone that has shared in the chat. These are really great reflections talking about younger generation may need to be strengthened or invested in. I know I was just sharing with Linda that, becoming fluent in Lakota is a goal for me, despite my grandmother being a Lakota language teacher. I'm not fluent in Lakota, and that's something that I would love to learn from as well. So we do want to be intentional, like we said, with recognizing that history. And so we are moving towards culturally sustaining and revitalizing, and you will hopefully see in the near future more resources and more tools and opportunities to have conversations around culturally sustaining and revitalizing approaches. One helpful way, though, at this point to think about culturally sustaining education, culturally sustaining and revitalizing, is to reflect on what aspects of our students' cultures are we considering and or integrating into our curriculum and instruction. And so a helpful thing to think about is thinking of the 3 levels of culture as a tree, right? And so the leaves of the tree represent the surface level of culture. These are observable features like language or holidays, celebrations, food, clothing. But then the next level of culture, right, is the shallow level, which is where unspoken norms and protocols kind of live. And these things are not as obvious as the surface level, but can still be discerned through careful observation and inquiry and relationships with people, right, who are members of that culture. But lastly, the deepest level of culture, really the foundation represented by the roots of the tree, are those collective beliefs and values that are really most often only identifiable by those who are active participants within that culture. And even then, it often takes self-reflection to be able to articulate what those features are. And so sometimes people use the analogy of an iceberg for the 3 levels of culture, but I really prefer to use the tree because I think it speaks to the dynamic nature of culture, right? We're not advocating that every single individual who belongs to a specific culture is going to have the same features at all 3 levels, right? But instead, when we think about a tree changes based on the environment that it's in. It changes on the seasons that are happening around it. And we think that speaks to the features of cultures as well, more realistically. And so this analogy of a tree comes from Zaretta Hammond's 2015 book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And in that book, she notes that historical integrations of culture into schooling have mostly engaged with students' cultures at the surface level, right? So the holidays they celebrate, the food they eat. And while these inclusions are helpful, neuroscience actually shows us that integrating deeper levels of students' cultures have higher cognitive impacts on students' learning. And so we really want to encourage you all to think about how are we really getting at the deepest level of our students' cultural strengths that they're bringing into the classroom with them. We do want to note that when we say being culturally sustaining, revitalizing, responsive, That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be an expert in your students' culture. And in fact, a sense of cultural humility is often necessary to recognize that as educators, we need to take the time to learn with and from students, their families, the communities we serve, if we're wanting to respectfully integrate their cultural strengths into the classroom. And so this starts with reflecting on our own cultural background and considering how it influences our choices as educators. And then when we model this sense of cultural humility, it teaches students the importance of cultural competency, and that building cultural competency, not only with our own cultural identities, but of those around us, is a lifelong skill and a journey that really doesn't have any end, right? It's moving away from that checking the box type of process into a cyclical, ongoing thing. We do want to offer, though, the Office of Indian Education firmly believes in affirming Indigenous knowledge systems. And so we believe that when educators learn about Indigenous knowledge systems, you can better understand your Indigenous students' shallow and deep levels of culture. And that's going to make integrating that into the classroom more meaningful. And so the term Indigenous knowledge systems originates in higher education. However, it's really just speaking to the ways that Indigenous peoples share, demonstrate, transfer, enact knowledge in their daily lives, and that those processes and systems have been developed over a very long time, as Professor Pino said in his introduction, right? And it's important to note that they are plural because we want to recognize the diversity of Indigenous nations and communities, and recognize that no one Indigenous knowledge system is going to look the same as someone else's, and that there is no one Indigenous knowledge system. However, thanks to the work of Indigenous scholars and researchers and really thought leaders, we have been able to identify some major traits that often cut across many Indigenous communities' knowledge systems, and that is that they are place-based, and they're often rooted in community and kinship. And these really can be demonstrated and seen when we look into traditional Indigenous education approaches that were often intergenerational, land-based, and really had to do with sustaining the entire community, right? So we just want to offer this here, and you'll hear us mention throughout our session today ways that you can affirm Indigenous ways of knowing and being while teaching about this topic.
So next we want to point out the National Council for Social Studies position statement on teaching about being culturally responsive and teaching about Indigenous peoples and nations. Helen and I did a prior training, which we will be putting online, in which this training goes over these 7 recommended recommendations in detail. And so we've got, commitment to be responsible representations, teaching current events, teaching about tribal governance and sovereignty, challenging that Eurocentrism and dominant narrative. And then number 5, we really wanted to point out is the idea of affirming Indigenous knowledges. And so this is something that Helen and I have really tried to model in a virtual setting, as well as we hope that you can take this forward in your classrooms and use and incorporate some of these Indigenous ways of knowing and being into your teaching. We also, the other 2 recommendations are learn from longstanding Indigenous advocacy, and also that idea of fostering relationships, which we also are going to mentor when we talk about our communities of practice later on.
And so now we want to transition into thinking about the general trauma-informed lens that we're bringing to our session today. And so as a reminder, we showed you this slide towards the end of part 1 of this series. And the intention was to highlight the fact that as teachers in the classroom, we don't necessarily need to know the specifics of the trauma that certain students are working through in order to be trauma-informed, right? We're not necessarily advocating for you to determine which of your students and their families have been directly impacted by the history and legacies of boarding schools, but instead we asked you to consider your shared responsibility within the public schooling system, given what you had learned about the history and the impacts of federal Indian boarding schools. And so you can see on the side of the chart that's talking about being trauma informed rather than being trauma specific, it says down at the bottom, trauma-informed education recognizes that trauma is omnipresent and emphasizes a shared responsibility to mitigate the impact. And so we wanted to, again, recognize we're not necessarily advocating that you ask or try to determine who's been impacted directly by this history and experiences, but be mindful of how it might have impacted and to consider that as you move forward. So let's talk a little bit more about what we can do as teachers in the classroom, specifically what is within our role and responsibilities. So one part of being trauma informed is recognizing that certain topics can re-traumatize or cause harm if not accompanied by intentional planning and instruction. And as teachers, we have the opportunity to hold space and provide students with the tools and the language to make meaning from the true history of topics like Native American boarding schools. And so we wanted to highlight this 2021 article by First Nation Indigenous educator Suzanne Methot from Edutopia that offers some really wonderful considerations for when we're preparing to teach a topic like Native American boarding schools. And so first and foremost, she emphasizes the importance of helping students make meaning from the emotional responses that they might have. And her suggestion of how to do that is through using inquiry and academic discussions to not only process the information, but also any emotional reactions that may come up. And so specifically, what she offers is recommendations for how to prepare for that as an educator, what to think about and what to plan for. Is her recommendation is to work outward from the self. So really have students or learners consider their own role and relationship to the topic, and to then move backward toward a nuanced understanding of history. And so this is what we asked you to do in part one of our series, when we asked you to focus on those two main kind of guiding questions throughout our time of learning about the history and the intergenerational impacts. Just recall that we asked you to consider, how does learning this information change the way you view your role as an educator in the public schooling system? We also asked you to consider the question, what do you view as your responsibilities as a public educator towards Indigenous peoples, students, families, and nations, right? And that goes along with her second recommendation, which is to avoid centering non-Indigenous people and their feelings, but really move towards relationships and responsibility. So as Linda said, we really were hoping to model this approach. We hope that you felt that the questions, the guiding questions we offered last in part one, and the space to come together in a small group and process allowed you to make meaning from the quite honestly, very emotional history, right, of the history of federal Indian boarding schools. And then her last recommendation that I think is absolutely critical, and we hope you keep in mind throughout our session today, is this idea of portraying Indigenous peoples with agency. We know very often the representation that we see of Indigenous peoples in K-12 education often shows them either in the past as very passive figures in history, or erases them completely. And so to push back against that and to go along with that first recommendation from the NCSS position statement, we encourage you to think about how are you portraying Indigenous peoples with agency, talking about stories of resistance, how the federal Indian boarding schools were not something that just happened to Native peoples, but they survived. They also continue to practice their languages, continue to practice their cultural traditions, and how you can ensure you're bringing in a balanced representation to your instruction.
So next, we wanted to share with you some great guidelines that also apply and can be used in your classroom when teaching about, difficult subjects and trauma that has happened, especially generational trauma, because it's not just with our Indigenous students, but you have historical generational trauma for Asian American students. You've got historical trauma from descendants of enslaved peoples. So there's a lot to go on. And we find that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has put this framework or guideline that really does a good job that applies to many different instances throughout history that have caused trauma that can then create that kind of intergenerational trauma that you may see in some of your students presently today. The first one I wanted to point out is, it kind of ties to a couple of ones, is the idea of terminology and vocabulary. So defining your terms and striving for precise language where everybody's on the same page and comes to the table with the same understanding of vocabulary is an important piece of that. Another one I wanted to highlight was avoiding simple answers to complex questions. There may not be answers to the questions that you're asking your students to engage in, but there are questions that are considered settled that you don't want to engage in inquiry. Things like, did the Holocaust really happen, is not a question to ask your students. It did happen. And the same thing with Native American boarding schools. Was it a good way or bad way to do it? No, that's not the kind of inquiry you want to do. So you want to do more of maybe what were the impacts or effects of those kind of difficult situations. Again, Helen already mentioned this, the idea of striving for balance and looking for perspectives to inform your study, avoiding comparisons of pain. And this is where it's not something where you're trying to do a pain Olympics, as I've heard it described, but it's really making those connections more so than comparisons. One was not better or worse or different. It's just making those connections and maybe the ways in which governments treated these peoples alike, between Japanese incarceration camps, enslaved peoples, Native American boarding schools, right? You can make those connections and see some of those continuing things, especially when you go with the next piece that I want to highlight, which is contextualizing the history, which Professor Pino did such a phenomenal job of putting it in that broader perspective of US history, but then also looking from a high school perspective of what's going on to Indigenous peoples outside of the United States. And how is that kind of making those connections to those similar types of events. Also, translating statistics into people, and that gets along with using balance and looking at perspectives. We want to hear the story from the people that experienced it, if that makes sense. You want to use narratives from Indigenous peoples or people that were there, and honoring those oral traditions and oral stories that are passed down through generation are just as important as a document or piece of paper. And to then be mindful when we're making those responsible choices of what narratives you use. For example, I know, using the Holocaust as an example, a lot of teachers, especially in middle school or elementary, might use The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is a very, very popular book that teachers use to teach the Holocaust. However, when you look at the book, it's actually taught from the perspective of a little German boy. It's not taught from the perspective of a survivor or from a Jewish person or someone that was incarcerated and put into concentration camps. So given that it's from the dominant culture, it's got a much different point of view. And so you want to be wary not to use stories like that or narratives like that, and use that balance of letting the people tell their own story. And so we wanted to share that with you today.
And we hope you see all of these guidelines and the ones in the previous slides demonstrated as we go through some of the specific resources and strategies that you can use to teach this topic. With that, we recognize the importance of giving you all time to process and make meaning from the information that was just shared. So we would love to send you into a breakout room of about 4 to 5 people. We'll be using the same talking circle protocol that we used in part 1 of our series. And all that is, if you're not familiar, is that we're asking that you allow each person in your breakout room the opportunity to share their response to these prompts or share their response to the information that was just shared. And then step back and allow each person to share before you have further discussions or you start building off. And this is a way to ensure that your space is very equitable and inclusive. And so again, we've offered 2 questions here. How might we apply a culturally sustaining and revitalizing and/or trauma-informed approach to teaching specifically about boarding schools, but what might be some challenges with that? But again, one of the intentions behind a talking circle is that you are given the agency as a participant in the circle to share what feels right to you, right? So if you have a reflection about what was just shared that doesn't necessarily answer one of these 2 questions, that's perfectly acceptable, and we encourage you to share that with your group. And so we'll take about 8 minutes to go into our breakout rooms, and then we'll come back for a short break.
I'm gonna pause.
Okay. All right, thank you everyone for taking a quick break. We hope you were able to take care of your needs. We are going to transition now into exploring the various different types of resources and approaches that you can take to teach and learn about Native American boarding schools. And I do just want to begin with a note that nearly every resource you see in these slides is hyperlinked, so that when you receive the PDF of the slides, you can click directly on the image and we'll open up the link that it's referencing. But we will also be sharing towards the end of our session today a single link that has a collection of resources in one place where you can also locate everything. All right, so I will hand it over to Linda.
So before we move on to our resources, we really want to talk about information literacy. And I talk about this as opposed to media literacy because media sometimes can be narrowing, and I think it also can have now a negative connotation today. So I like to refer to it as information literacy. And it's really this idea that, especially at a secondary level, it is our responsibility to teach our students to be knowledgeable consumers and producers of content. As far as a consumer goes, this is looking at the sourcing of everything. Who created the content? What message are they trying to get across? What techniques have been used? How might different people understand this message differently? What values or lifestyles are being represented in this message, as well as any time they share or produce information, they're then producing it, right? So we want to make sure that they produce information, asking themselves, what are they authoring? What message are they reflecting? What points of view are they perpetuating by sharing information? And also just looking at it being communicated effectively. There's a great resource from the developers that did the Stanford History Education Group, and they came up with something called CORE, and it's civic online reasoning, which is not necessarily civics like government civics, but it's really about information literacy. And it's this idea that we want to teach our students to read laterally as opposed to vertically. So when you see your students and you give them a source, they always start at the top and then read it and then figure out, okay, what's going on with this source. And the idea is to start to teach your students to, as soon as they look at a source, they leave that page, especially if they're online, and pull up another page to investigate who that came from, and then pull up another page to find out what else was said for it, pull up another page to do this. And so it's this idea of reading laterally before they even read vertically. And there are, 5 basic steps of really teaching kids to be good consumers of media. We do have a website recorded that you can go out to and watch on our website. But it is that idea of when we use these resources, we want to teach that information literacy to our students as well.
Yes, thank you, Linda. And so the first type of resource we want to highlight in this section is maps for their ability to connect to place. So as I noted earlier in the section on Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous peoples have long-standing relationships with place and the non-human beings that they share those places with, including animals, plants, land, and waterways. And so bringing maps as a primary source into your instruction about Native American boarding schools is a great way to contextualize this topic by providing insights into a place at a particular time, or by demonstrating how places and understandings of places can change over time. And so we encourage you to contextualize this topic by prioritizing, the particular place in which you and your students are learning. And you might do this by exploring how Native American boarding schools influenced the local area around you, before zooming out to show that boarding schools were not only a national phenomena, as we mentioned, but really happened on a global scale to Indigenous peoples in different contexts, of course, right? We can't say that it was the same across all those places, but we got to bring in place to contextualize that. And so the use of maps also allows us to make really clear connections between the removal of Indigenous children in communities and the process of land dispossession, which Professor Pino highlighted numerous times in part 1. And we want to ensure that we give you resources for talking about that with your students as well. So now Linda's going to take you through a protocol for exploring maps that you can use in your own classroom.
So this protocol and methodology that we're going to explore really can be used for any primary source, but we're using it today to highlight a really recent, fabulous primary source from the Department of Interior, who has come out with just part 1 of their report on the federal Indian boarding school system. And so this is from an appendix in that system, and we're going to take you through this as if you were my students. And so just kind of, we're going to use the chat as our main form of communication for this. So first, when you give your students a primary source like this, and in this case, we're using a map as an example, you just have them observe what's on the primary source. So in this case, if you can for me in the chat, just describe what you see. No analysis, no reflection, just what is on this primary source that I have given you. And just take a moment, type that into the chat if you are able to. Good, so locations of clusters of school sites, where the schools were, locations of schools. Dots all over the country, more dots in the Great Plains and in Arizona and Oklahoma. Excellent. Texas is void of all sites. Yes, completely, not a single one. Colorado has a lot of sites. Yep. Fantastic. So this is what you want your students to look through, right? And I thank you, Don, for talking about the, according to the U.S. Department of Interior. So again, it gets to that civic online reasoning, that reading laterally, who created this site. So that leads us to the next step. So as you're doing this, if your students, especially when they start doing these kinds of investigations and inquiry work, right, they may not be really familiar with it because social studies has been so marginalized in elementary schools. And social studies elementary teachers are just now starting to really understand how to use the new standards and how to integrate them in with their classes. So you're going to see a little bit of a lag in high school of students that really have not engaged with inquiry much. So the nice thing about this, and I put the link into the chat, is you can use this to prompt your students as they start to get used to using inquiry and asking questions themselves. So you can ask things like, what did you notice first? What is the size and shape of the map? What kind of geographical elements do you see? Do you notice anything that doesn't belong, or do you think something should belong on the map? What, if any, words do you see? Again, that gets them to that sourcing piece of it. So then when we move to reflect, now we want our students to really ask themselves, what's going on with this map, right? What was the U.S. Department of Interior trying to convey in making this map? Who was the audience for this map? Why was this map made? Now, obviously, this is a very current map, but Helen in our next section is going to show you some more ancient maps, and that would be a great comparison to kind of overlay and have kids look at maps. When you do things with older primary sources, you can always ask your students, well, how would this look today if this exact same primary source was created today? So that's another good way to kind of bring it relevant. Also to make, like Helen had said, we want to teach about Indigenous peoples as having agency and the fact that they're still here. For a lot of Americans, they believe, because Indigenous peoples are taught as being something in the past prior to 1900. So again, bringing it to current events is a big piece of what we want to do, as well as making it relevant to our students' lives, right? And so then after we have our students reflect, then we move on to the question. And this is where we really get them interested and investigating what further, right? So what kind of questions, like, what do you wonder about? Like, why isn't there a single school in the whole state of Texas? What did Texas do, or what happened? I mean, does that mean there were no Indigenous peoples in Texas? No, of course not. But what was it about Texas that they didn't have any schools? And that also can bring in some of the larger context, the history that goes along with it. You've got differences with the East Coast having very few Indigenous boarding schools. Why is half of the state of Colorado empty and the other half not? So there are lots of questions asking kind of who, when, why, where, what, that can really lead to further and deeper study by your students. And that also gives them that agency that they're investigating what they want to on the subject, which means that they're excited, they're interested in it. And that also then leads to that revitalization effort, because again, you have Indigenous students in your classrooms in Arizona. We have a large number of federally recognized tribes, but also people from out of Arizona that are, their Indigenous tribes are elsewhere in the states, but they live here in Phoenix because we are such a transplant state. Very few people were born and raised here, right? So we want to recognize and kind of honor that as we go through this system and give the students that agency.
Yeah. And so another way that you can utilize the resources that are in the federal investigative report that was published in May of 2022 is the appendix also includes maps for all 50 states as well. So we would encourage you, something else that you could do is to do some type of map annotation activity to consider what boarding schools are nearest to where, again, you and your students are learning, and how does your position on that map influence what you're able to learn about those school sites. And so we just want to highlight that you can explore, go deeper, zoom in even more using the maps in that appendix. And as we mentioned earlier, maps are also a really great way to make the connection between Native American boarding schools and the land loss experienced by tribal nations. And so these are just a few of the other types of maps that are not specific to federal Indian boarding schools, but that can enrich your instruction on this topic. And so if we look at the graphic on the left-hand side that's about Indian land sessions, this actually comes from a curricula that we will be highlighting later on, but it's a great way to look at these changes over time and to maybe put it side by side with what the timeline of the federal Indian policies that Professor Pino shared in part 1, or some of the history and development of federal Indian boarding schools specifically, and what's happening in tandem, right, as those things are being developed with the land. Because that's another way we can bring in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, is honoring and recognizing that long-standing relationship to land and how that was a big part of what was happening with the federal Indian boarding schools.
If I can interject just real quick, one thing, especially from a high school point of view, as a great way to start, the map up in the top right-hand corner that's moving is a great way. And I've done this with my students when I taught about the Middle Passage. And where you can use this and how you can use this in your class is just as a starter, as a way to introduce a unit. And what I would do is I would not say anything, have the students take out a piece of paper and just have them write down their reactions, where it's completely silent and you're not doing anything and the kids are just writing their thoughts down. And so again, like I said, I've done this with another type of map like this that talked about the Middle Passage. And so you do this, show it to them once, and then show it to them a second time, and have them look at it a second time, have them then get into groups and compare and discuss what are they seeing, what might be some of the questions that they then are engaging in, to again bring that inquiry in and have them come up with questions about what they want to investigate. Again, giving them agency, making it relevant to today. But sometimes I find just like that silent image, like a silent movie, can be an extraordinarily powerful thing, especially when you see a graphic like this being used, where you see that loss visually. It's been very powerful, as well as you can imagine.
That's a great recommendation, Linda, and I really love your suggestion of having them talk to each other and process that information orally, because as we'll mention later on as well, bringing in, again, discussions and ways to process information that isn't just writing. Of course, we do want to encourage reading and writing skills, but just bringing in another way of processing that information.
So as Helen mentioned earlier, many Indigenous communities use storytelling to pass down knowledge. And so we do want to honor and also to acknowledge that this is another way of bringing in Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So using storytelling is one widely recognized with Indigenous communities as a pedagogy that they use. It's also one of the recommendations through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that you use storytelling, and using books and articles can be a way to center those Indigenous voices and experiences. And even though we teach high school, it is something that I have to say, reading aloud to your kids is something that can be very, very powerful. And even though you're teaching, students that are bigger than you and they're seniors in high school, right? I still would whip the book out and I would read to my kids and have them follow along. Again, you're introducing and bringing in some of those Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but it's good teaching as well too, because not every student learns the same way. So it's a great way that you can kind of do multiple things and have multiple benefits just by doing a read aloud with your students, with documents and things like that, and using storytelling in that way for high school students. So don't discount a read aloud for older kids.
Yeah, and we recognize we're gearing this a little bit towards social studies instructors at this point, right? But there's no reason you can't take excerpts from some of these books here to enrich, right? To humanize, as we said on the other side, some of this history. And so these are a number of books that we are recommending that are appropriate for the secondary level. And they take a variety of experiences, everything from memoirs to stories. The book on the screen, The Marrow Thieves, is actually a post-apocalyptic kind of sci-fi book that integrates Indigenous perspectives and the history of boarding schools in this just like really different way that really pushes back at that consistent kind of inclusion of Native peoples in the past, and shows that Native peoples are here today and also in the future as well. It can just be a different way to bring in this lens on this topic. And so I think Linda will be dropping in the chat a few links for larger book recommendation lists, but we also encourage you in our resource collection to look at the recommendation list from the National Native American Boarding School Museum, Healing Coalition, and then also sites like the American Indian in Children's Literature blog by Dr. Debbie Reese that has a list specific to boarding and residential schools. Definitely be mindful of the authors of the books that you're selecting or the excerpts, and consider the context, because a lot of the lists tend to group both Native American boarding schools and residential schools that occurred in Canada, but it may be very important to make those distinctions about the context of the story that you're sharing. There's also, for the secondary level, a lot of scholarly texts that you can draw on. A number of Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars have done really detailed research into what happened at the boarding schools, what the effects were, and how that impacted the students who were there. And so these are a number of nonfiction books that you can also use to enrich your instruction on this topic. And so you'll see that there's specific time periods, specific locations, places. And so you can use this in a way that makes sense for your students. We also want to recommend using informational text to enrich this topic. So as we mentioned, the federal investigative report was just published in May of 2022. So this is a very timely and recent topic that's getting a lot of attention right now. And so you can use news source sites like Indian Country Today, which is a completely free, open access, Native run news organization. And when the report dropped, they published this really great article that was well done and includes a lot of other links and resources about the investigative report. But in our resource collection, we also have a collection of resources from News ELA or Newsella. And that entire collection of 50 plus texts is all texts that focus on contemporary Indigenous issues. And so again, even though we're learning about the history of federal Indian boarding schools, you can bring it into the context of today by, again, showcasing Indigenous peoples with agency, things that are happening in tribal communities like language and cultural revitalization, but also topics like repatriation, right? With the discovery of mass grave sites, there is legal legislation, right, that says that those remains need to be repatriated and returned to the tribal nations that they come from. And so again, you can bring in a very contemporary context into this topic as well. It doesn't have to be all historical.
One thing I also wanted to point out with informational text is using that ADE has provided for schools for the next 3 years, Discovery Ed. Well, I guess it's 2 years now we have left. So Discovery Ed. So take a look and go out there and search through the channels and find more resources that you can use while we have that as an option too.
And I do know that Discovery Ed is doing some work to provide some specific Native American resources that are not quite available, but they will be, and they will be available for all teachers in Arizona to share their instruction in this area.
Can I just interject something real quick,
Yeah,
Linda and Helen?
Absolutely.
I just happened to be in Albuquerque, New Mexico this afternoon, and my family actually live in close proximity to the old Albuquerque Indian boarding school. And, you know, the mainstream media is also picking up on looking at the history of federal Indian boarding schools since this has become publicized in the mainstream media, especially the Department of Interior initiative, the national initiative. And the Albuquerque newspaper, the Albuquerque Journal, just has an insert on federal Indian boarding schools that I just found today. It says,
Oh, wow.
it says Indian school gravesite buried under city park, you know, and not many people in Albuquerque, New Mexico even know that there was one of the largest federal Indian boarding schools here in the country, much less the graveyard that is addressed specifically in the report. So, you know, again, if you keep an eye out, you know, do literary searches in the mainstream media, you'll find across the United States a growing awareness on the issue that we're discussing, federal Indian boarding schools. So I just wanted to share that. And just one quick thing about maps too. An exercise, and since we're dealing with high school educators this afternoon, in both my sociology and American Indian Studies classes, I'd ask the students to draw a map of the United States at the time of independence from England after the Revolutionary War, and to draw a map of the United States. And many of them would draw the entire 48 state map of the US. And I'd say, no, you know, there'd be a couple students, surprisingly, over time that would draw the 13 original colonies, you know, but immediately, you know, in their retention of, or lack of retention of history, it wasn't the entire 48 states of the interior, that the lower 48, as we call them today. It was just on the Atlantic coast. But, you know, we tend to forget that, you know, in our historical knowledge. So I just wanted to share those two things real quickly. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for sharing those with us. I really, really appreciate it. And it also brings up another idea too, especially for you world history teachers, is to look at what is going on with other governments, like the government of Australia, the government of New Zealand, the government of Canada, right? All had Native, you know, Indigenous boarding schools on their countries, and like the US federal government, are starting to reconcile with that and come out. And so you do see articles and events that happen as far as current events. And so that would be a great place that, even though, yes, you are teaching world history, right, it is important to talk about those kinds of circumstances, those kinds of policies that governments had on a global scale, and make those connections as well. And what you're doing, that including those Indigenous perspectives from a world point of view, you are then setting those students up for success for when they do take US history, and when they do take then government and econ, that those US history teachers, government teachers, and econ teachers don't have to do as much of the background and the context, because you were able to bring in those Indigenous voices and talk about those boarding schools. When you get to, 19th and 20th century history, you can bring that in and address it for them. And that's huge. So that leads us to our other primary sources. Again, selecting those sources with care and thoughtfulness, but then also looking at government sites. So we've got here a bunch of sites for the United States government, the National Archives, Library of Congress, the National Museum of the American Indian, which is a phenomenal museum in the Smithsonian family of museums. They also have a lot of things online. The Arizona Office of Indian Education has taken the time to curate and collate the tribal nations of Arizona. So you have that as a resource. You also have a lot of state museums and digital Arizona library through the Arizona Historical Society. You've got the University of Arizona, Arizona State University, NAU, all have great examples of curated Indigenous peoples histories out there for you to use with regards to bringing in some of that context and teaching about Native American boarding schools. And just like the US government has done this, you can go out, and the government of Canada has done this. The government of New Zealand has done huge things bringing in Maori history and Maori traditions into their government, so that you can go out and search on New Zealand sites. The government in Australia has also done the exact same thing to bring in those. So there are other sites in other countries that you can do. You can go out and look at what has happened in South Africa, what's happened to the Hmong people in Southeast Asia. So it's not just a US thing. And that's kind of what I wanted to bring across with these primary sources, for especially for those world history teachers, that you can do that and introduce that into your classrooms and get those students prepared and set them up for success, as well as recognizing that history in other people's too. So your Indigenous students will say, oh, hey, this happened to other people. It's not just a US thing as well. So I wanted to share that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Helen to talk about primary source sets.
Yes, so we do want to highlight, of course, places where you can get primary source sets specifically about Native American boarding schools, including the Library of Congress, the Digital Public Library of America, but also the National Archives, but then also some less large, or not as large, sites such as the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center, which includes some primary sources that you might not find on some other sites, things like lists and ledgers collected from the sites, student records, things that we want to be mindful of and respectful of course. Is it appropriate to integrate that? But just encouraging that, yes, please go to those large governmental sites, but I dropped the sites, the Office of Indian Education's website too, that includes, as Linda said, the tribal websites for all 22 federally recognized tribes in the United States as well. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Linda so we can quickly show you some tools that will really help for these primary source analysis.
Correct. So here are some we've shared with you and done the observe reflect question, and I put the link to in the chat. They have resources for every type of primary source you can even possibly imagine. But I wanted to highlight two here, and one was the National Archives, which I'm going to have Helen just kind of show you on our website. And they also have primary source analysis guidelines for every type of primary source, but I like these a little bit better for a couple of different reasons. One, they have them for different levels of readers. And so like the last year I was teaching, I had a world history co-taught class where I had half the class were on IEPs. And of those kids, I had 5 of them that were reading at a 3rd grade reading level. So what I would do is I would use primary sources in my class. Just because they're on IEPs doesn't mean that they can't do this. They can, and you should. But what I would do is I would print out the emerging reader or the younger reader one for my kids with really low reading levels. And then I would print out the ones with like sound recording here for my regular kids. So they would all do the same, listen to the same recording, but they had different ways to interact with that material. And so I think that's an important thing. It also, when you have a substitute, this is a great activity where you can leave a primary source with your sub, have them guide through with these worksheets, and then you're not losing time. They're doing meaningful work while you're gone, investigating primary sources, and you're covering tons of standards with this. The other thing I also wanted to point out about the National Archives is that they do have them in Spanish. So if you have English language learners, or if you teach in or if you have students that maybe English is not their first language and they learn better in Spanish, give them the worksheets in Spanish. Who cares, right? Anything to help the kids learn. And so that's what I like about that. Then the next thing I want to show you is my new, just latest and favorite. I stinking love this website. Like I probably shouldn't love a website, but it is the best way to bring in and vary your teaching using inquiry with any primary source that you want to. So Helen will just scroll through it real quick. But it honestly, if you're like, oh, I'm a little stale, I've been teaching this for the same way, I need to kind of vary it up, come out here and investigate some of these different ways of thinking routines. And it's great because a lot of them do incorporate those Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which I really like. But there's a ton of them. And we're going to go through one just really quick with you here in our next activity. So this is called Circle of Viewpoints, and it's from the Harvard Project Zero webpage. And what I like about this is we have a primary source here. Helen found the source. And again, we want to make sure that we're always having our kids sourcing the materials. So that way they are being informational literate, we're improving their information literacy. So in this case, this is from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And the source at the bottom says, educating the Indians, a female pupil from the government school at Carlisle visits her home at Pine Ridge Agency from a sketch by a corresponding artist. So how I would use this primary source in my classroom is just to a routine for exploring perspectives, right? So first thing I'd like for you to do is just brainstorm, and you can just type this into the chat. What might be some of the different perspectives of this primary source? So take a minute and do that for me, please.
Yes, these are great.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have the perspective of the young woman coming back from attending a boarding school, right? You have the perspective of the tall man that's kind of standing over her. You have the perspective of some of the children. You have the perspective of the women in the story. You have the perspective of the mother. And I did like that someone did put in here, if I'm scrolling back up, someone said the sketch artist, right? So obviously the person that drew this has a perspective. Frank, Leslie has a perspective. Why did he, I'm assuming it's a he, include this into their magazine? And again, the idea is that as we do this, right, we want them to, one, identify that there are multiple perspectives to the same story. And again, that brings in then some of those Indigenous ways of thinking, that everything has a point of view, right? And even things that we may not assume from a dominant narrative have a point of view does, right? So if you look at something like a beaver making a dam, what's that beaver's point of view? What's the fish point of view, right? And just getting them thinking about things in a little bit different way. So then after this, we want to look at having them pick one of those perspectives and explore that. And you can do that, especially as your students maybe are not used to inquiry. You may want to start with sentence starters. And so here are a few different kinds, and you can click through the next two there. So different sentence starters that you want them to think of, right? I'm thinking of, and from the viewpoint of, I think this, a question I have. And so really getting that investigation and that thinking, and you can also bring it to today too. You know, how might this relate to, say, someone that's attending a boarding school today? You know, what kind of perspectives would they have? And again, being mindful of not perpetuating negative stereotypes. So whenever you have students assume the role of someone else, you do want to be mindful of that and just be cognizant, and also kind of watch your kids, especially at first, as they're getting used to doing those kinds of things. But really the purpose in doing this is encouraging students to see and explore multiple perspectives, right? We want them to understand that different people can have different kinds of connections to the same event. So the girl coming home maybe is excited to share with her family, or at least in the picture she is, right? But it looks like the man standing over her may not be as excited the fact that she's really dressed in a Western style dress, right? So why is that? And investigating that kind of what's happening there, or the children going through that. So it's that idea that these connections will influence the way people think and what they do. This can be used from an application point of view with really any kind of topic, any kind of artwork that has complex issues, right? It works well when students are having a hard time seeing others' perspectives, and this prompts them to really look at other perspectives and get away from the idea that there are only two sides to an issue, right? You may have 3 or 4 or 10 different sides of looking to an issue, and it can be used to kind of open up discussions and dilemmas for our students. Again, just be mindful, right, of having that same level of care and intentionality with the sources you choose, as well as taking a moment to engage maybe with multiple sources to show comparisons in a context at that time. And also just being sure that our students, the whole point is to give them a deeper understanding of the issue and of things. So next we want to show you another idea of a primary source, and that's just quotes. A great way to maybe do a starter or as an exit to a lesson is using a quote. And so don't be afraid to take a primary source and excerpt it down and just take the essence of it. You can do that with just a quote. You can do that by rewriting a primary source and making it more easily digestible. Like the Stanford History Education Group, if you use any of their stuff, they're great for World and US. They've already excerpted down as well as rewritten some sources for you. And you can do that yourself. As long as you're not reselling it, you're fine from a copyright point of view. And so the key to this is just making sure that when you do it, you do include that sourcing. Like you're constantly teaching students to be literate with the information that they're consuming. Where did this source come from? Who wrote it? What's the larger context with regards to that?
So the last type of primary source we want to highlight is, again, coming back to the federal investigative report. We've touched on the narrative aspect of the report that has really amazing research and stories, narratives included within it, and also the maps that are included in the appendix. But the appendix also includes briefs on all 408 identified federal Indian boarding school sites. And each brief includes information around the name, possible other names for the school address, the start date that it opened, and the end date that it either closed or whether it's still operating. And so I chose this particular brief from Wide Ruin, Arizona, the Wide Ruins Boarding School, because as you can see in the quote enlarged at the bottom, the ending of the general notes notes that the school currently operates as Wide Ruins Community School, a tribally controlled school under the Navajo Nation. And so again, this is another way to bring in that representation of agency, is to make sure you're talking about how many of these schools now, because of the legislation that Professor Pino showed us in part one, this era of self-determination and government to government relationships, a lot of tribal nations now are able to control and operate those schools and provide schooling that is more culturally sustaining and revitalizing. And so this is a great way to dig deeper into federal Indian boarding school sites that may be closest to you. It can be difficult to find vetted information, right, about very specific sites. And so this is a really great resource included within the investigative report. And we encourage you, we will of course update our resource link with anything else that comes out of this federal investigative initiative. But we encourage you, as Manny said as well, to search mainstream media representation, see when new information is coming out about this topic so that you can stay up to date.
So the next type of resource that we wanted to highlight is using videos and podcasts in your classrooms. So by using these different kinds of multimedia resources like videos and podcasts, they're a great way to, again, promote that information literacy, right? And that's what we want to constantly be teaching our kids, especially in high school, the amount of information that they are consuming and producing by sharing tweets, TikToks, whatever it is really enormous. Additionally, using these types of resources can be a way to incorporate oral traditions into your instruction. It's also by using these videos and podcasts that are made by Indigenous peoples telling their own story is, again, a great way to bring in those voices into your classroom, but to also teach them in a current context, right? To teach that, like Helen mentioned, that revitalizing and agency that we want to promote with Indigenous and marginalized peoples as a whole, right? It doesn't just pertain to Indigenous voices.
Yes, so we're going to run through this section a little bit quickly, just so you have enough time to explore and connect with each other. But we do want to highlight that the Heard Museum here in Phoenix has a whole exhibit, longstanding exhibit about federal Indian boarding schools, but they've turned that entire exhibit into a virtual resource that you can then use, including a large number of short video clips that showcase boarding school survivors, scholars, researchers speaking about what happened in those schools. So the one we've linked here is about the outing program, which we learned about in part one, and you could hear someone who was a curator at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center, right, speaking about that program. We also, of course, are highlighting, you can use documentaries in your classroom, like this one that's about America's Native American boarding schools in the context of Utah. But as we mentioned earlier, I'm so happy that we were talking about looking at recent news sources, because yes, there's a lot of mainstream media coverage happening over the last year or so about Native American boarding schools. And we encourage you to showcase Indigenous leaders like Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland from Laguna Pueblo, speaking about the importance of this federal investigative report, even reflecting on that. Why has this report been recently published? What is the purpose of this report? What motivated it? So we encourage you to use resources like that. But you can also use this particular lesson from the National Museum of the American Indian. That's actually a lesson called Native Words and Native Warriors. That's about Native American code talkers and centers Indigenous languages. But there's very clear connections, right, to Native languages and what happened at federal Indian boarding schools. And it's very interesting to learn about how many of the Native American code talkers from the over 30 tribes that contributed in World War I and World War II were boarding school survivors. And so what was that like for them to go through the boarding school, have their language stripped away, right, but then needing it, having it valued by the US military in that context. And what we appreciate about this lesson, it's a whole website that you can use, is that they have audio clips from boarding school survivors and code talkers that you can play in your classroom in your lessons. You also could check out podcasts like the Carlisle Indian School Research Project's Indian School Research Podcast, and use clips of that within your instruction.
So with lesson plans, we want to recognize obviously that teachers are so overwhelmed. And again, like we mentioned earlier, we're not asking you to completely rewrite your curriculums or your scope and sequences, but we just want to make sure that you are highlighting and bringing in those lessons where you can. And so we wanted to highlight some very specific lessons that are ready to use. You just have to they're plug and go, and give you an example of these that can emphasize using resources with Indigenous peoples and organizations with regards to Native American boarding schools.
Yeah, so some of these resources here come from organizations like the National Park Service, the U.S., which is within the U.S. Department of the Interior, thinking about the context of the Carlisle Industrial School, within the context of the Indian Wars that were happening. You can see here they have some guiding questions right here on the document. We also found this great lesson that is put from PBS, again, putting in Native American boarding schools into the conversation of human rights. And so again, these resources, we just encourage you to review, of course, beforehand to ensure that they are appropriate for your students and that they make sense for the context of the students that you serve, right? So things like Away from Home, the American Indian boarding school stories from the Heard Museum, again, can be upsetting to some students. So be mindful of thinking about what is the school community that you serve's relationship to this topic, right? So both of these are resources. Again, they have a whole curriculum that you can use from the Heard Museum, but they also have their exhibit in a virtual form here. Lastly, we would really want to highlight the Truth in Healing curriculum from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And within this curriculum, they have it for all grade levels, but one at the high school level. And what we appreciate about this curriculum is that it is very asset-based, right? It's coming from the strengths, centering the strengths of Indigenous peoples. And so they have 4 main lessons in the curriculum that cover the history, the impacts, the stories, but also the healing that has to do with Native American boarding schools. And each lesson follows a similar structure of into, through, and beyond that really allows students to, as we've highlighted so many times today, learn through inquiry and have them really explore these resources to come to their own conclusions about the topics, right? And particularly this lesson includes a lot of word definitions for words that may be difficult to find student-friendly definitions for in other cases, things like intergenerational trauma, but we also appreciate that they bring in the concept of intergenerational wisdom, right? Bringing in that balance of not always centering the harm that occurred, but also the strengths and the positive aspects that Native communities still have today. They also make connections to contemporary topics that I haven't seen in any other lesson plans, like things like pandemics, right? Boarding schools and pandemics, which would be extremely relevant to our students today, given that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted our Native communities, as well as played a big role in the sense of urgency around language revitalization when we think about the fact that many of our first language Indigenous language speakers are elders, right? And so who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So they really dig deep and talk about pandemics in the boarding schools and how the spread of diseases really was quite common. And so again, be mindful when you're talking about these topics. Such a massive amount of loss is associated with all of these various topics that we want to be intentional, and that's why we appreciate that they bring in this concept of healing as well. I think it really helps the lessons come full circle into this more positive light at the end. So we want to encourage you to explore this resource as well.
So as we look at Native American boarding schools and the Arizona standards, it really is reflected in everything that we teach. So going forward, with this. I'm not going to have you do this part where we're in the chat because they're just honestly too many. So let's go look at how they can be applied to our standards. So instead of going out and finding the exact standard for the SPs and for the actual coded standards, I really wanted to highlight the course considerations, which these are the topics in which you can bring into Native American boarding schools into your classrooms, because for every course that we teach in high school, you will be teaching all of the SPs for high school, which those are the inquiry standards. You will be teaching some history standards, government standards, economic standards, and geography standards. So regardless of the fact that you're teaching a government class, you are teaching history, you are teaching some geography, you are teaching some economics. So you're teaching all of those coded standards, but I wanted to really touch here upon the standards in which you have the context that they can be taught. So even though you're teaching economics, you can teach about the national economy and what did it do by having Native American boarding schools? What was that loss of interaction and trade that happened? How did the federal government and those policies, what did that do to the national economy? Or when we teach about human interaction in the environment, right? What did it do when reservation system came about and we were forcing Indigenous peoples into areas that they either lived on or sometimes historically had nothing to do with that land? And what does that do to their economy and way of life? So there are lots of charts and graphs that even though you teach economics, you can still teach about Native American boarding schools. And I gave you some examples with regards to world history before. Obviously with US history, there are lots of examples. And even with civics and government, when you get into those governmental policies, go back and look at what Professor Pino did and showed us. You can go back and search further in his conversation because we have that highlighted as well, and really pull out those excerpts and use those in a government class. So you should all be using all of the standards when you're teaching. You don't teach just the C coded standards when you're teaching a civics class or the E coded standards when you're teaching an economics class. You are teaching bits and pieces of all of them in a full, robust social studies course, regardless of what the content area is.
Yeah, and Linda, your examples around economics just now made me think of the importance of examining the economics within the boarding school as well, right? Thinking about how that funding was coming from the federal government, but that often was supplemented by the manual labor of students themselves. And so what a interesting concept to apply, right, these economic theories to. So yeah, these are really great examples. And now I'm so happy we have plenty of time to allow you to not only dive deeper into the resources that we've highlighted today, but also, again, to return back to those small groups, to really process this information and think about what are you taking away from our time together today? How are you going to apply what you've learned to your instructional design? What connections are you making to your specific context in classroom? Really appreciated that in the first talking circle, people were really making connections to the specific students they serve. And I would encourage everyone to consider that as you move forward, thinking about how you're going to teach about this. How does who you're teaching with, who you're teaching to, right, influence how you're going to present this topic and how you're going to prepare for it. And so we are going to drop the link in the chat to the resource collection. And please, you can share that with anyone. If you have suggestions for things that can be added, you can let us know. And then we're also sharing a link in the chat that I'm just going to open up quickly so everyone can see what that is, to a slide deck where you can record some of the takeaways that you and your group are discussing. So if you're in breakout room 1, you'll go to slide 1. If you're in breakout room 2, you'll go to slide 2, and so on and so forth. Add some of the takeaways that you have, some of the examples you might be thinking of where you can incorporate this or integrate this into your instruction, and or where you might apply some of the things that you've learned today. And so we'll take, Linda, about 10 minutes, right?
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to stop the.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to reflect on everything we talked about today, to share ideas with each other, takeaways. We were looking at the slides, and we just appreciate how everybody brings their own unique perspective into our learning space. And so looking at the takeaways, it's just interesting how certain maybe comments or resources or approaches are really resonating with you, and we're excited that it's relevant. We are going to move into our closing. We have just a few minutes left. In just a word or two, we'd like to ask you to just share maybe what you're taking away from our space today. What did you learn? Something that's resonating with you? Or if you still have a question that you really feel needs to be answered, please share that in the chat as well. But we want to take just a minute or so to do some closing reflections on, in just a word or so, what you're walking away with today. Great.
I like that motivation. That's fantastic. Thank you.
If I won't type mine in the chat, but I would definitely say connection. It's so wonderful, even just virtually, to be in a space with you all, with educators who are wanting to have these conversations and teach this topic. So we're very grateful. New perspectives. Nice. Oh, thank you so much for joining us 2 days in a row. Inquiry being a big theme.
The historical wisdom rather than just the historical trauma.
Yes.
Learning is balanced. I like that. That's fantastic.
For podcast videos or a group to connect with elders and survivors. We don't have resources right now, Dawn, around how to connect with elders and survivors, but that's something that Linda and I can definitely look into more. If there's particular resources out there about how to navigate those conversations with people who may be survivors or relatives of survivors. And so for the sake of time, we do want to share our survey that we're asking you to complete. As we shared, this was a collaboration between the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center through Native American Connections and a grant provided by the Administration for Native Americans. So using...
Oh, Helen, I muted you, sorry.
That's okay, thank you. We want to make sure we're collecting some data, some input from you all about how effective this learning was, just to provide to our partners, our community partners, that they can then use in their grant. And so I'm going to let Linda just speak really briefly to our community of practice, which we really hope you will join us at.
Exactly. So we want to model Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and we recognize that obviously this is an exciting thing and you've got lots to do. And so we want to, one, hear about it and bring us back together once a quarter for secondary teachers. We'll be sending that out in our newsletters. So when you get the email from me tomorrow, most likely sign up for those newsletters. And that's how you'll be able to find those links to join us for our once a quarter community of practice, where we can find out what some of the successes and things that you've been doing to incorporate Indigenous voices, but also Native American boarding schools into your classroom. But then also maybe what are some of the challenges that you've had and barriers that you face. So that way we can really, as a community, support one another going forward to make sure that this important information is taught and included in our schools. That being said, for attendance, please type your first and last name into the chat for me real quick. Our time is up for today, and that will be a way that I know that you have been here. It will not be until tomorrow when you get that email from me tomorrow that will include this presentation. It will include the chat. It will include the survey again, as well as everything else that you need from us. And we have our contact information on there for you. And again, we just want to say I want to say thank you so much for joining us today, or multiple days since we had part one as well. We appreciate all that we have learned from you and hope that you've learned a little bit from us. And I will let both Helen and Professor Pino say goodbye as well.
Yes, I'd just like to say, Pilamayaye, thank you so much for being here today. We are super excited to continue supporting you. And again, we really hope you will join us at our community of practice so that we can continue to learn with and from each other over this school year. Professor Pino, I want to give you the space to share anything you'd like as well.
Helen. Thank you, my relatives, for again participating in this valuable informative program. I would just like to say, if you have not utilized all the resources that are available, and you have any follow-up questions that you would like to address specifically to myself, I am retired now, but I continually check my email. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to communicate or contact with me. And again, thank you to Helen and Linda. Thank you.
Thank you.